Evelyn, 7 months pregnant, shifted uncomfortably in her first-class seat, the pain in her back growing worse by the minute. All she needed was a second pillow to ease the discomfort, but when she politely asked the flight attendant, Ms. Richards, for help, she was met with a cold, dismissive response, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. Humiliated and frustrated, Evelyn sent a quick text to her husband, Marcus, not knowing that this minor request would soon lead to a much bigger confrontation. Where are you watching from? Like, share, and subscribe for more. Evelyn shifted uncomfortably in her seat, trying to ease the dull ache that had settled into her lower back. 7 months pregnant, she was no stranger to discomfort, but today, the pain seemed to take on a life of its own. She ran a hand over her growing belly, feeling the tiny kicks from her baby, a bittersweet reminder that she was not alone on this journey. The soothing hum of the jet engines provided a gentle background noise as she glanced out of the window, watching the clouds pass by. The world seemed so peaceful from above, but on this particular flight, it felt like her calm exterior was beginning to crack. She was flying alone, the one downside to her pregnancy. Her husband, Marcus, was already at their destination, waiting for her in the city they had both called home for years. This trip was necessary, but it had come at the expense of Evelyn's comfort. She had been cautious about flying while pregnant, but now that she was nearing her third trimester, the unease in her body made it harder to hide the pain. Settling into the plush first-class seat, she placed a small pillow behind her back to provide some support. It helped a little, but not enough to relieve the ache. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply, and then looked around the cabin. The flight was mostly quiet, with a few passengers chatting in hushed tones, and the occasional sound of a drink being poured or a snack being passed. She envied the ease with which others seemed to glide through the flight, unaware of the physical toll this journey was taking on her. As the flight attendants moved down the aisle, Evelyn briefly considered asking for another pillow. A small thing, really, but the support would mean so much. The discomfort in her back was enough to make her think she might have to give up on trying to make herself comfortable. When the flight attendant, a woman with short brown hair and a crisp uniform, passed by, Evelyn hesitated for a moment before raising her hand slightly. "Excuse me," Evelyn said, her voice polite but tired. "Could I please have an extra pillow? My back is starting to hurt." The attendant, whose name tag read Ms. Richards, stopped abruptly, turning toward Evelyn with a stern expression on her face. She paused for a moment, scanning Evelyn with a quick glance before responding. Evelyn could feel the woman's eyes scanning her, not just her, but her whole demeanor, as if there was something about her that was worth scrutinizing. "You already have one," Ms. Richards said curtly, her tone almost dismissive. Evelyn blinked, taken aback by the coldness in her voice. She hadn't expected such an attitude, especially after asking so politely. "I know, but I'm pregnant," Evelyn explained, trying to keep her voice calm. "It's just that my back is really hurting. If there's an extra pillow available, I'd really appreciate it." Ms. Richards sighed loudly, the sound carrying through the cabin. Evelyn's cheeks warmed as the passengers around her started to glance her way, undoubtedly hearing the exchange. It was as if she had just done something terribly wrong. The flight attendant placed a hand on her hip, looking at Evelyn with clear irritation. "First-class amenities are limited, ma'am," Ms. Richards replied, her voice louder than before, for everyone to hear. "We can't just give out extra pillows just because someone asks." The word stung. Evelyn's heart dropped in her chest as she felt the humiliation wash over her. She had only asked for something small, something that could have made her journey just a little bit easier. Instead, she was being treated like she had asked for something unreasonable. She wasn't trying to be demanding, she just wanted comfort, something that should be simple, especially when it came to a pregnant woman. "I wouldn't ask if I didn't really need it," Evelyn said softly, trying to defuse the situation. She didn't want to cause a scene. She simply wanted to get through the flight without feeling like every step she took was met with resistance. But Ms. Richards's face remained unchanged, and if anything, she seemed more irritated. "Look, I understand you're pregnant, but rules are rules," she snapped. "If I give you another pillow, then I'll have to give everyone else one too. That's not how this works." Evelyn's fingers tightened around the armrest of her seat, frustration bubbling in her chest. It wasn't about special treatment, she just wanted to be treated with basic courtesy, something she had hoped to receive on a flight that promised comfort and care. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say another word, another flight attendant, a younger woman with dark curls pinned into a neat bun, stepped forward hesitantly. "I think there might be some extra pillows in storage," the second attendant, Ms. Lara, suggested softly, glancing at her colleague. Ms. Richards turned sharply to face her, the irritation clear in her expression. "I think I know my job," she retorted, her voice biting. "We have to maintain fairness. If we make exceptions for one, then where do we draw the line?" Evelyn felt her frustration rise as Ms. Richards continued to speak, her voice louder and more forceful. She tried to calm herself, but the humiliation of being treated like a child in front of everyone weighed heavily on her. Her eyes glanced around the cabin, only to meet the gazes of the other passengers. They saw it too. They had all heard what was happening, and yet, not a single person spoke up. Silence hung in the air, thick with discomfort. Evelyn swallowed the lump in her throat and lowered her gaze to her phone, hoping to find some distraction. Her fingers moved quickly over the screen, typing out a message to her husband. "Marcus, they won't give me a pillow. This flight attendant just humiliated me in front of everyone." Her fingers hovered over the send button for a moment, then she pressed it, knowing her husband would take action. Seconds later, her phone vibrated with a reply, and Evelyn couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. Her husband, Marcus, always knew how to handle situations like this. As she waited for another message, Evelyn's eyes darted toward Ms. Richards, who was still moving through the cabin, oblivious to the fact that the situation was about to escalate far beyond what she could have imagined. Evelyn sat back in her seat, feeling the weight of the humiliation settle deep within her chest. The flight attendant, Ms. Richards, was still moving down the aisle, as though nothing had happened, continuing her duties with a clipped, professional air. Evelyn took a slow, shaky breath, trying to push the anger down, but it was difficult. She wasn't the kind of person to cause a scene, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. The flight attendant had dismissed her request with such callousness, and the entire cabin had witnessed it. Her fingers curled tightly around her phone. Without thinking, she quickly typed a message to Marcus, her husband. She needed to let him know what had happened. He was always her calm in the storm, her anchor, and she hoped that, somehow, just telling him would make her feel a little better. Evelyn knew he wouldn't let this slide, not when she had been treated so poorly. "Marcus, they won't give me a pillow. The flight attendant just humiliated me in front of everyone." She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The seconds felt like minutes as she sat there, staring at the screen, waiting for a reply. Her mind raced, still processing the way Ms. Richards had treated her. She had been polite. She had been patient. And yet, none of that seemed to matter. She had only been met with disdain. Finally, her phone vibrated. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat as she saw Marcus's name appear on the screen. "What's the flight number?" he replied. His response was short and to the point, but Evelyn could feel the weight of the words. It was clear to her that Marcus was already making plans to handle this. She smiled faintly, her spirits lifting just a little. Marcus wasn't the type of man to let things slide. If he was asking for the flight number, it meant he was about to take action. The kind of action that Ms. Richards would never see coming. Evelyn quickly typed the details into her phone. "Flight 378, New York to Los Angeles," she sent, her fingers trembling slightly as she hit send. Her phone buzzed again a few moments later, and this time, she couldn't help but grin at the words that appeared on the screen. "Stay put. I'll handle it." Evelyn didn't need anything more than that. She knew her husband well enough to understand that when Marcus said he'd handle something, he meant it. It was his way of taking charge, of making things right. The quiet authority in his voice, even through text, was enough to reassure her that the situation would be addressed, and Ms. Richards would regret her actions. She leaned back in her seat, trying to relax, but the tension in the air was suffocating. She could still feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, some pretending to be absorbed in their own worlds, others stealing glances when they thought she wouldn't notice. The whole exchange had been loud enough for everyone to hear, and the silence that followed felt thick and uncomfortable. Evelyn could feel it in the way the other passengers shifted in their seats, the way they avoided her gaze. It was as if the air itself had changed. Meanwhile, Ms. Richards seemed completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. She moved through the cabin with a practiced ease, offering drinks and snacks, attending to the needs of the passengers as though nothing had happened. Evelyn's eyes tracked her movements, noticing how easily she seemed to slip back into her routine. The flight attendant seemed oblivious to the fact that the situation had already escalated. She was still acting as though she held all the power, as though she was in control. Evelyn clenched her jaw, trying not to let her emotions take over again. It was hard to believe that this woman could treat her like that without any repercussions. But deep down, Evelyn knew better. She knew Marcus would take care of it. She knew that the wheels had already started turning, and Ms. Richards's misplaced sense of authority was about to come crashing down. As Ms. Richards moved toward the front of the cabin, Evelyn noticed a change in the air. The passengers had grown quieter, more subdued. There was a tension now, a collective awareness of the conflict that had unfolded just moments before. No one was speaking, but everyone knew what had happened. The quiet was deafening, a stark contrast to the hum of the engines and the normal buzz of a long-haul flight. Evelyn's fingers moved over her phone once more. She didn't want to seem like she was just waiting for Marcus to handle everything, but she knew her husband's next move would be swift. She felt a strange sense of calm wash over her as she thought about the changes he would bring about. Marcus had a way of making things right, not just for her, but for everyone affected by an injustice. And this time, the injustice wasn't just personal. It was about how people in positions of power, like Ms. Richards, could treat others so poorly without facing any consequences. At the front of the cabin, Ms. Richards took a moment to pour herself a cup of coffee. She sipped it slowly, her eyes scanning the cabin, seemingly oblivious to the weight of the situation. She muttered under her breath as she glanced back at first class, her face showing the kind of frustration that came from being inconvenienced by something as trivial as a passenger request. It was clear that she had no idea that things were about to take a drastic turn. "I think she really needed that pillow," a younger attendant, Ms. Lara spoke up hesitantly, her voice low. She was clearly trying to tread carefully around Ms. Richards. "Don't start with me," Ms. Richards snapped, her voice sharp as she turned to face her colleague. "We have rules for a reason, and we can't just make exceptions. Not everyone gets to have a pillow just because they ask for one." Ms. Lara bit her lip, her gaze shifting away. She didn't say anything more, but Evelyn noticed the discomfort on her face. The younger woman seemed torn, unwilling to challenge Ms. Richards, but also aware of how unfairly Evelyn had been treated. Back in her seat, Evelyn fought the rising frustration in her chest. She couldn't help but feel as though she had been dismissed so easily. She wasn't asking for special treatment, just the same treatment as anyone else who needed something simple to make their journey more comfortable. But Ms. Richards had seen her request as an inconvenience, as though Evelyn was taking advantage of the situation. As the minutes ticked by, Evelyn's thoughts drifted back to Marcus. He would handle this. She didn't know how, but she had no doubt that by the time they landed, Ms. Richards would wish she had never crossed paths with her. And that realization, more than anything, brought Evelyn a sense of peace. Evelyn adjusted her posture again, shifting in her seat in an attempt to ease the growing discomfort in her back. Her pregnancy was starting to take its toll, and the small pillow she had placed behind her wasn't providing nearly enough support. She tried to distract herself by gazing out the window, watching the clouds pass by beneath them, but it was hard to ignore the ache in her body. Every movement, every shift, seemed to only make things worse. She glanced around the first-class cabin, trying to find a distraction, but all she could see were passengers who seemed to be lost in their own little worlds. The soft murmurs of conversation filled the air, but the tension between her and Ms. Richards lingered, a silent presence that seemed to grow thicker with each passing minute. It was clear that no one was willing to speak up. Even though Ms. Richards had treated her with an unnecessary level of harshness, everyone else had remained silent, as though they were afraid to get involved. It made Evelyn feel small, as though her discomfort didn't matter, that she was just another person to be dismissed. The flight attendant continued down the aisle, moving swiftly, serving drinks, and flashing fake smiles at the passengers. She seemed to go out of her way to avoid making eye contact with Evelyn, as though she had already deemed her request insignificant. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the armrest as Ms. Richards passed by again. The woman's tone had been dismissive the first time, but now it seemed more like a personal vendetta. Every interaction felt like a reminder that she was in the wrong place, asking for the wrong thing. The rules, after all, had to be followed, no exceptions. "Is there anything else I can get for you, Ms. Williams?" Ms. Richards asked, her voice sharp as she addressed another passenger a few rows ahead. Evelyn felt her stomach tighten. The flight attendant hadn't used the same polite, warm tone with her. She hadn't even bothered to say "ma'am" the way she had with the others. The disparity was impossible to ignore. But Evelyn remained silent, not willing to escalate things further. She wasn't going to let Ms. Richards win by drawing attention to the situation. But it was becoming harder to breathe as the weight of the injustice pressed down on her chest. "I think there might be some extra pillows in storage," said another voice. Evelyn turned slightly in her seat, spotting Lena, the younger flight attendant who had been quietly observing from the back of the cabin. She was a stark contrast to Ms. Richards, who seemed to rule the cabin with an iron fist. Lena was more reserved, her expression soft but not apologetic. Ms. Richards stopped in her tracks, her eyes narrowing as she turned toward Lena. Evelyn noticed the change in Ms. Richards's posture. The tension in the air seemed to snap, and the older flight attendant's lips curled into a thin, irritated smile. Evelyn could feel the power dynamic shifting, but not in the way that Lena intended. "I think I know my job, Lena," Ms. Richards replied, her voice cold. "We have policies, rules for a reason. We can't just hand out pillows like they're candy." Evelyn couldn't help but feel a sense of frustration bubble up in her chest. She wasn't asking for anything unreasonable. She wasn't asking for an extra seat or special treatment, just a little comfort, something that would help her make it through the rest of the flight without feeling as though her back was going to give out. But Ms. Richards was so focused on the rules that she didn't even consider the human aspect of the situation. To her, Evelyn's request was nothing more than an inconvenience, a disruption to the efficiency of the flight. Lena hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. She glanced back at Evelyn, her lips pressing into a thin line as she quietly stepped away. Evelyn caught her gaze for a moment, and the younger woman gave a barely perceptible nod, acknowledging the unfairness of the situation. But that was all Lena could do. There was no way she could challenge Ms. Richards without consequences, and she knew it. Evelyn felt the frustration build inside her as she tried to push back the sting of humiliation. She had always prided herself on staying calm, on not making a scene. But everything about this situation felt wrong. Ms. Richards wasn't just enforcing rules. She was taking pleasure in making Evelyn feel small, in showing her who was in charge. The flight attendant had made it clear that she was above Evelyn, that her discomfort didn't matter. And that, more than anything, stung. Passengers nearby were watching, but no one spoke up. Evelyn's eyes scanned the cabin, but everyone seemed to look away the moment her gaze met theirs. The silence was deafening, and it felt like a personal attack. She wasn't looking for someone to fight her battle for her, but it would have been a small comfort if just one person had said something, anything, to show that they recognized what was happening. But there was nothing. "I wouldn't ask if I didn't need it," Evelyn said, her voice steady but low, as she turned back to Ms. Richards. She tried to de-escalate the situation, but the words came out almost like a plea. She wasn't asking for sympathy, just for understanding. But Ms. Richards's expression remained unchanged. The flight attendant simply crossed her arms and tapped her foot, waiting for Evelyn to say something more. "You should just be thankful for the pillow you have," Ms. Richards snapped. "First-class amenities are limited, and we have to maintain fairness. If I give you another pillow, I'll have to give everyone else one too. And that's not how this works." Evelyn blinked, caught off guard by the callousness in her tone. The flight attendant was so fixated on the idea of fairness that she had lost sight of basic courtesy. Evelyn could see it now. Ms. Richards wasn't enforcing a rule, she was using it as a shield to cover her own arrogance, her own sense of entitlement. She didn't care about Evelyn's needs. She didn't care about her pregnancy or her discomfort. All she cared about was showing who was in control. A flush of embarrassment crept up Evelyn's neck. She wasn't the kind of person to demand attention, to speak out in public, but everything about this situation was starting to feel unbearable. It was as though she were invisible, like the flight attendant and everyone else on this plane had forgotten that she mattered. That she had a voice. The moment stretched, long and uncomfortable, until Evelyn finally sighed, her fingers tightening around the armrest. She wasn't going to let this flight attendant control her. She wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of losing her temper. She just needed to make it through the next few hours. When they landed, she would deal with it. With Marcus's help, she would make sure this never happened again. But for now, she had to stay calm. She had to keep it together. As she sat back in her seat, The weight of the situation settled deeper into her chest. The humiliation wasn't just in the way she had been treated, it was in the silence around her. The passengers had all seen what happened, but no one had said a word. They had all been complicit in her humiliation, whether they realized it or not. And that, more than anything, was what hurt the most. She could feel her phone vibrating against her leg, but Evelyn ignored it for the moment. She wasn't ready to face the world beyond the flight just yet. She needed a moment. The world would have to wait. Evelyn sat back in her seat, her back still aching from the discomfort that seemed to deepen with every passing minute. The flight felt like it was dragging on forever. She had tried to distract herself with a book, but her mind kept drifting back to the conversation with Ms. Richards. The way the flight attendant had dismissed her, so coldly, so without empathy, still stung. It was as though her discomfort didn't matter, as though she wasn't deserving of basic respect. But what hurt the most wasn't just the way she had been treated. It was the silence of the other passengers. Everyone had witnessed the exchange, but not a single person had said anything. They had all turned away, pretending not to hear, pretending not to notice. Evelyn had tried to brush it off, but the humiliation gnawed at her. She had always believed in standing her ground, but something about this felt different. The weight of the situation had begun to settle deep in her chest, making it harder to breathe. She just wanted to get through the flight, but every time she looked up, Ms. Richards was there, moving through the aisles like a queen who had complete control over her kingdom. Evelyn's phone buzzed in her lap, the familiar sound pulling her out of her spiraling thoughts. She glanced down and saw a message from Marcus. A sense of relief washed over her. He was the one person who could make everything feel a little more bearable, no matter the situation. "Stay calm," the text read. "I'm handling it. You've done nothing wrong." Evelyn's chest tightened in response, and she quickly typed back a brief reply, just 2 words, "Thank you." She didn't know how much he could do, but knowing that Marcus had her back was enough to keep her steady. For now, she had to remain composed. She couldn't let Ms. Richards or anyone else see how much the situation was affecting her. She just had to breathe and wait. Minutes passed, but then the soft crackle of the intercom pierced the calm of the cabin. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. She couldn't help but notice the shift in tone in the announcement, which was directed specifically to Ms. Richards. "Ms. Richards," the voice said. "Please report to the cockpit immediately." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. It was strange, hearing her name called so urgently. She watched as Ms. Richards froze for a moment, her stiff posture betraying the unease she clearly felt. The flight attendant looked down the aisle, her eyes scanning the cabin, as though she were trying to find an escape route. But there was none. She straightened her uniform and marched down the aisle toward the front of the plane, her steps quick and purposeful. Evelyn turned her head slightly, watching the older woman as she walked away. There was something different in the way Ms. Richards held herself now, a tension in her movements, like she knew something was coming. Evelyn couldn't help but wonder what was about to happen. Had Marcus already gotten involved? Was the situation escalating? She couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to witness something she couldn't fully comprehend yet. A few minutes later, the cockpit door opened, and Ms. Richards stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind her, cutting off her access to the rest of the cabin. Evelyn shifted in her seat, trying to focus on anything other than the growing sense of anticipation in her chest. The cabin remained still, the passengers quietly watching the door. A soft murmur of whispers filled the air as people speculated about what was happening behind it. Inside the cockpit, Captain Bennett was seated at the controls, his expression unreadable as he adjusted some settings on the panel in front of him. Ms. Richards took a breath, trying to steady herself before she addressed the captain. "Captain," she began, her voice slightly shaking. "What's going on? Why did you need to see me?" Captain Bennett didn't immediately answer. Instead, his eyes flickered to the small screen in front of him, where a video call was in progress. Evelyn's stomach twisted as she realized that someone else was involved. The man on the screen was unfamiliar to her, but the way he carried himself, his sharp demeanor, immediately indicated his importance. "Ms. Richards," the man on the screen said, his voice calm but laced with authority. "I think it's time we had a conversation about your conduct." Ms. Richards's face paled as she looked at the man, a mixture of confusion and fear overtaking her. She glanced back at Captain Bennett, who finally turned his gaze toward her. There was no hiding it now, whatever was happening in the cockpit had escalated far beyond a routine procedure. "I don't understand," Ms. Richards stammered. "What are you talking about?" "I was just doing my job. I was enforcing the rules." The man on the screen didn't let her finish. "We've received a direct complaint from corporate headquarters, Ms. Richards," he said, his voice sharp. "A first-class passenger was mistreated on this flight. And you were the one who treated her that way." Ms. Richards froze, her mind racing as the words sunk in. "Corporate headquarters? A direct complaint?" She blinked in disbelief, not sure how to process what was happening. The man's eyes narrowed. "I'm sure you know who I'm referring to," he continued. "The woman you humiliated earlier, Evelyn Williams." Ms. Richards's pulse quickened, her throat going dry. The name rang a bell, but it wasn't until she saw the look on the captain's face that it clicked. Her stomach dropped. Evelyn Williams? It was impossible. The name sounded so familiar, and then it hit her. Evelyn wasn't just any passenger, she was married to Marcus Williams, the CEO of the entire airline. Her heart sank. She had just humiliated the wrong person. "Do you realize who you've been treating like this?" the man on the screen asked, his voice growing colder. "Evelyn Williams is married to Marcus Williams, the owner of this airline. And now, you're going to have to explain yourself to him." Ms. Richards's head spun, and she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had been so focused on enforcing rules, so fixated on the idea of fairness, that she had failed to see the bigger picture. The consequences of her actions were about to unfold in ways she couldn't have imagined. "Do you understand what this means?" the man asked again, his voice stern. Ms. Richards could barely choke out a response. I understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The weight of the realization hit her like a freight train. She had crossed a line. A line she couldn't come back from. There was no undoing what she had done. Evelyn's husband was the one person she could never afford to offend, and now she had to face the consequences of her ignorance and arrogance. "Good," the man said. "When this flight lands, you will be required to explain yourself directly to corporate. Until then, I suggest you prepare yourself for what's coming next." Ms. Richards's mind raced as she turned toward the cockpit door. Her body felt heavy, and the weight of her actions hung over her like a cloud she couldn't escape. She had humiliated the wrong person, and now, she would have to face the fallout. The flight was no longer just a journey, it was a countdown to her downfall. The minutes ticked by, each one dragging longer than the last. Evelyn's heart raced as she sat in her first-class seat, the tension in the air palpable. She hadn't moved since the conversation in the cockpit, and though she tried to distract herself, her mind couldn't escape what had just happened. Ms. Richards had been called to the cockpit, and Evelyn knew, deep down, that the situation was escalating far beyond her original expectations. She glanced around the cabin, noticing how the other passengers were behaving. A few of them had already started to whisper among themselves, their eyes darting nervously toward the cockpit door. Evelyn could sense that the shift in energy was spreading, and with every passing second, she felt a growing sense of power. She was no longer the humiliated woman who had been dismissed so coldly. Something had changed in the balance of authority on this flight, and she was no longer the one who needed to worry. As she looked out the window, waiting for the moment when Ms. Richards would return, she caught a glimpse of the flight attendant approaching. Ms. Richards stepped into the first-class section, her face a mixture of unease and forced professionalism. She straightened her back and cleared her throat, but there was no denying the vulnerability in her eyes. "Mrs. Williams," she said, her voice low but loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. I wanted to apologize for my earlier behavior. There seems to have been a misunderstanding." She forced a tight smile, but Evelyn could see the discomfort in her expression. Ms. Richards wasn't used to being in this position, she wasn't used to being the one at the receiving end of an apology. Evelyn didn't respond right away. She merely raised an eyebrow, staring at Ms. Richards with an unreadable expression. She could see the flight attendant squirm under her gaze, her eyes flickering nervously between Evelyn and the other passengers who were now watching the exchange with growing curiosity. The silence between them stretched, and Evelyn felt a small sense of satisfaction as Ms. Richards shifted on her feet, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of her own apology. "Are you finished?" Evelyn finally asked, her voice calm but firm. Ms. Richards flinched, taken aback by Evelyn's quiet authority. She cleared her throat, but her words faltered. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Williams. I should have handled the situation differently. It was unprofessional of me to speak to you the way I did." Evelyn leaned back in her seat, folding her arms across her chest. She regarded Ms. Richards with a steady gaze, letting the silence settle between them once again. There was no need to rush. She wasn't going to make this easy for her. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, waiting for a response, but Evelyn remained silent. The second stretched into an awkward eternity, and she could feel the tension building, both in the air and within Ms. Richards. Finally, the flight attendant couldn't take it any longer. "I just wanted to make sure you knew that it wasn't personal," Ms. Richards said quickly, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I was just following the policies of first class." "Policies," Evelyn interjected calmly, her voice cutting through the flight attendant's rambling. "I understand that you were following some sort of policy, but you didn't stop to consider that I might actually need something. I wasn't asking for special treatment. I was asking for basic comfort." Ms. Richards's face flushed slightly, and Evelyn could see the guilt beginning to sink in. She was now fully aware that her actions had crossed a line, but Evelyn wasn't going to let her off the hook so easily. "Do you know what was the most difficult part of all of this?" Evelyn continued, her voice steady but laced with quiet power. "It wasn't just the way you dismissed me. It was the way you did it in front of everyone. You humiliated me without a second thought. And for what? Because I asked for a pillow?" Ms. Richards opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. She had no defense. There was nothing she could say that would excuse the way she had treated Evelyn. The silence hung heavy between them, and Evelyn could feel the weight of the moment. This was her chance to make sure Ms. Richards truly understood the consequences of her actions. "You assumed I didn't belong here," Evelyn continued, her voice softer but still carrying the weight of her words. "You saw a pregnant woman in first class and immediately decided that I didn't deserve to be treated with the same respect as anyone else." Ms. Richards's eyes widened, and she took a step back, as though the realization was hitting her all at once. "I didn't mean." "Don't," Evelyn interrupted, her tone firm. "You did mean it. And you didn't just treat me like that, you treated me as if I didn't matter. As if I was a problem. But let me make one thing clear, I do matter. And I deserve to be treated with respect, just like every other passenger on this flight." Ms. Richards's face drained of color, and she dropped her gaze to the floor. The apology she had initially extended now felt hollow. Evelyn wasn't just asking for an apology, she was demanding acknowledgement, demanding accountability. And she wasn't about to let Ms. Richards off the hook until she got it. "I was wrong," Ms. Richards said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I misjudged you. And I'm sorry." Evelyn studied her for a moment, her gaze unwavering. This wasn't just about the apology, it was about making sure Ms. Richards truly understood the impact of her actions. "Good," Evelyn said quietly. "Because that's what it's going to take to fix this. Not excuses. Not empty apologies. Just the truth. You misjudged me, and now you're going to have to live with the consequences." Ms. Richards's eyes flickered with something, maybe shame, maybe fear. Whatever it was clear that the power had shifted. Evelyn wasn't the one squirming anymore. "Thank you," Evelyn said, her voice smooth, but there was an edge to it. "Now, I expect the same courtesy that every other first-class passenger receives. No more dismissals, no more attitudes. Just respect." Ms. Richards nodded quickly, her hands trembling slightly as she forced a smile. "Yes, Mrs. Williams. I understand." Evelyn sat back in her seat, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had stood up for herself, and in doing so, she had forced Ms. Richards to confront her own biases. The flight attendant had finally realized that Evelyn wasn't someone to be dismissed easily. And as the silence lingered, Evelyn felt the weight of the moment finally begin to lift. This wasn't just about getting a pillow, it was about making sure no one, especially not someone like Ms. Richards, could ever treat her like that again. As Ms. Richards walked away, Evelyn settled back into her seat, the quiet hum of the engines filling the space between them. For the first time since the encounter, she felt at ease. She had made her point. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The plane began its descent, the subtle vibrations signaling that they were nearing the end of their journey. Naomi looked out the window, the city of Los Angeles stretching out beneath her. She felt a quiet sense of satisfaction settle over her. The uncomfortable moments earlier on the flight, the humiliation, the dismissal, were beginning to fade. She had handled it, not just with grace but with a quiet power that had left her feeling more in control than ever before. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. A text from Julian. She smiled softly as she read his message. "Stay calm. I'm here." It was all she needed to hear. Naomi knew that Julian was more than capable of handling this, and now that he was in control, she could finally let go of the frustration that had been building throughout the flight. Julian had never been the type to let things go unchecked, and this was no different. She could already picture how this would play out, how Ms. Richards, the flight attendant who had humiliated her, would be held accountable. The plane touched down smoothly, the wheels of the aircraft making a soft thud as they met the runway. Naomi felt the subtle shift in the air. Passengers in first class, who had mostly kept to themselves during the tension-filled flight, began to stir. Some of them stole glances in her direction, their faces now marked with the realization that something important had happened. Word had gotten out, Naomi wasn't just another first-class passenger. She wasn't the woman who had been publicly dismissed and humiliated. No, she was the woman who had made sure that disrespect wasn't going to stand. As the plane came to a complete stop, Naomi buckled her seatbelt, her fingers absently tracing over her growing belly. Her mind wandered back to the events of the flight, how Ms. Richards had treated her, how the other passengers had silently observed the exchange. She could almost feel the collective shift in the cabin, as if everyone was now processing what had just happened. They knew who she was now. And they knew that Ms. Richards had made a huge mistake. A soft ding rang out, signaling that the seatbelt sign had been turned off. The passengers started to rise, gathering their belongings, ready to leave the plane. But no one in first class seemed in any hurry to get up. There was a palpable hesitation in the air. Passengers lingered, watching with curiosity as they waited to see what would happen next. It was then that the first-class cabin door opened, and Naomi heard the unmistakable sound of confident footsteps approaching. Her pulse quickened, but this time, it wasn't anxiety, it was anticipation. As the figure appeared in the doorway, a wave of recognition swept through the cabin. Naomi's husband, Julian, stepped into the plane with the kind of presence that commanded attention. He moved effortlessly through the aisle, his sharp black suit immaculate, his posture perfect. He didn't need to say a word, his very presence made it clear that he was in charge. Passengers who had previously been indifferent to Naomi's situation now sat up straighter, their eyes widening as they realized the man walking toward her was no ordinary passenger. He was Julian Williams, the owner of the airline. The air in the cabin seemed to thicken as the power dynamics shifted completely in Naomi's favor. Julian didn't spare a glance for anyone else. His gaze was focused solely on Naomi. The moment their eyes met, a small, knowing smile tugged at her lips. He had arrived. The situation, which had once been entirely out of her control, was now fully in his hands. As he reached her seat, Julian extended a hand toward her. His fingers brushed against hers, and in that moment, all the tension from the past hours seemed to melt away. "Let's get you home," he said, his voice calm, steady, and full of quiet authority. Naomi placed her hand in his, feeling the reassuring strength of his grip as he helped her to her feet. "Julian," she murmured softly. "You didn't have to come all the way here." He chuckled softly. "I don't like loose ends," he replied, his voice smooth but with a sharpness that made it clear he wasn't taking the situation lightly. He glanced around the first-class cabin, his eyes briefly sweeping over the passengers who were still seated, watching the unfolding drama. His gaze was steady, commanding, and in an instant, the entire atmosphere of the cabin shifted again. Naomi wasn't just another passenger on a flight anymore. She was the wife of the man who owned the airline, and anyone who had doubted her worth now knew exactly who they were dealing with. As they walked toward the exit, Julian's hand lightly rested on the small of Naomi's back. The air around them seemed to hum with a new energy, an energy that made the passengers in first class uneasy. They had all seen what had happened, and now they saw the consequences of crossing the wrong person. At the same moment, the front of the plane was buzzing with activity. Ms. Richards, who had just tried to regain control of the situation, was now standing frozen in the galley. Her posture was stiff, her expression pale as she realized what was happening. She had humiliated the wrong passenger, and now, the full extent of her mistake was dawning on her. Julian didn't waste time on pleasantries. As he stepped off the plane with Naomi, he nodded to the security officers who had been waiting at the gate. The two officers stepped forward, their presence commanding and professional. They were there to escort Naomi and Julian out of the terminal. As they moved past, one of the officers called out to Ms. Richards, who was still standing in the galley, visibly shaken. Ms. Richards, the officer's voice was firm, but not unkind. Please step forward. Naomi couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as she glanced over her shoulder at the flight attendant. Ms. Richards's face had drained of color, her entire demeanor shifting as she understood that her actions had consequences. Julian's presence alone had made it clear that the situation had escalated far beyond what she could have anticipated. Naomi was no longer a victim of humiliation. She was no longer a woman whose request had been dismissed. She was the woman who had stood her ground, who had made sure that her voice was heard. And now, as she walked through the airport, with Julian by her side and security officers at her back, the power dynamic had shifted entirely in her favor. Ms. Richards was left behind, powerless to undo the damage she had caused. The journey from the plane to the car felt almost surreal. Naomi walked beside Julian, her hand intertwined with his. The power, the control, it was all in their hands now. The world around them was still, but in the quiet of that moment, Naomi knew that everything had changed. And it wasn't just because of the way she had been treated, it was because she had the power to make sure it never happened again. As they approached the exit, Julian's phone buzzed, and he quickly checked the message. Naomi glanced at him, sensing the finality in his movements. "It's done," he said, his voice low and decisive. "This isn't over for her." Naomi smiled slightly, knowing exactly what he meant. As they stepped into the car, she leaned back against the leather seat, feeling a deep sense of relief wash over her. She wasn't just going home, she was going home victorious. The battle had been fought, and in the end, she had come out on top. And Ms. Richards? She would learn the consequences of underestimating someone like Naomi Williams. The hum of the airplane engines had long since faded, and as Ms. Richards slowly made her way toward the cockpit, she could still feel the weight of what had just happened. She had never felt so exposed, so completely out of control. Her stomach churned as she walked down the narrow aisle, the eyes of the passengers still heavy on her back. The lingering silence in the first-class cabin was deafening, and it only added to the realization that she had made a mistake, one so big that it threatened to unravel everything she had worked for. Ms. Richards stood outside the cockpit door, the sound of her own rapid heartbeat pounding in her ears. She didn't know what was waiting for her on the other side, but she had a sinking feeling it wasn't going to be good. She had humiliated the wrong passenger, and now, her actions were coming back to bite her. "Come in," Captain Reynolds's voice came from inside, cutting through the tension. She took a deep breath and stepped inside, her body rigid, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to maintain a sense of composure. But it didn't help. The moment she entered, the sight before her made her stomach drop. The captain, who usually exuded calm authority, was seated in his chair with a cold expression. But it wasn't just him in the room. Elias Grant, the senior operations manager of the airline, sat beside him, his gaze sharp and calculating. His presence in the cockpit was unusual, and it immediately set off alarm bells in Ms. Richards's mind. She had worked under Elias for years, and she knew that when he was involved, it meant trouble. "Sit down," Captain Reynolds said, his voice stern but neutral. Ms. Richards hesitated for a moment before taking a seat across from them. The silence in the room felt thick, suffocating. She had been dreading this moment, and now it had come. The conversation that had been building for the entire flight was about to unfold. Elias looked at her, his gaze piercing as he folded his arms across his chest. "Ms. Richards, I'm sure you're aware that we received a complaint from one of our first-class passengers." Ms. Richards nodded stiffly, her throat dry. "Yes, I know. It was a misunderstanding." Captain Reynolds's expression didn't soften. "The passenger you humiliated wasn't just anyone, Ms. Richards. She's the wife of Julian Williams." The name hit her like a punch to the gut. Julian Williams. The name she had heard whispered in the halls of the airline, the name that carried the weight of immense power. Naomi Williams, the woman she had dismissed so rudely, was married to the very man who owned the airline. She had no idea who she was dealing with. "I didn't know," Ms. Richards said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked down at her hands, a sense of guilt starting to creep in. She had no idea what kind of consequences this would bring, but she was certain they wouldn't be good. Elias leaned forward, his tone sharp. "Well, now you know. You've humiliated the wrong person, Ms. Richards. You've made a grave error in judgment." Captain Reynolds sighed, rubbing his temples. "The fact is, your behavior has escalated this situation to a corporate level. This isn't just a passenger complaint. This is a matter of how we treat our customers, especially our first-class passengers. And when that customer happens to be the wife of the owner, it's not something we can overlook." Ms. Richards's heart sank as the reality of her mistake began to sink in. Her mind raced, but she couldn't think of a way to explain herself. There was no excuse for what she had done. She had acted on assumption, on prejudice, and now she was paying the price. "We've already initiated a review of the incident," Elias continued, his voice calm but firm. "Julian Williams himself is involved. This won't end well for you if you don't understand the severity of this situation." Ms. Richards swallowed hard. She had worked under the airline's policies for years, and she knew that breaking protocol was serious. But she hadn't anticipated this. She hadn't anticipated that her actions would lead to such a significant consequence. Elias's gaze softened just slightly, but the warning was clear. "We will be taking action based on your conduct. A full review will be conducted, and I won't sugarcoat it, your job is at risk." She felt her world tilt as she tried to keep her composure. "I understand," she said, her voice shaky. Elias didn't say anything further. He stood up and gestured toward the door. "Go back to your post. You'll hear from us soon." As Ms. Richards walked back to the galley, her thoughts were a whirlwind. She had humiliated Naomi Williams in front of everyone, and now she was facing the consequences. But the consequences weren't just about her job, they were about the company as a whole. Meanwhile, across the country, Julian was working on the aftermath. As much as he was angry about the personal affront to his wife, he knew that the real issue was systemic. This wasn't just about one flight attendant's behavior. It was about the culture within the airline. It was about the assumptions that were made, the way passengers were treated based on their appearance, and the lack of accountability that allowed it to happen. Sitting in his office, Julian made a few quick calls, his mind already working through the logistics of the changes he wanted to implement. He knew that this incident had exposed something much larger than just a rogue flight attendant. It was a problem that had been festering for far too long. He picked up his phone and typed out an email to the corporate team. He wanted changes to be made, and he wanted them made quickly. Subject: Immediate changes to customer service policy. Team. As of today, I am implementing several changes to our customer service policies. This includes mandatory bias training for all first-class flight attendants and increased oversight on passenger treatment. We cannot allow incidents like what happened on Flight 378 to continue. We must ensure that all passengers, regardless of their background or appearance, are treated with dignity and respect. Furthermore, a new complaint system will be implemented across all flights, one that allows for accountability without the need for any special connections to escalate matters. This incident will be the last of its kind. Julian Williams, CEO, Williams Airlines. Julian sat back in his chair after hitting send, a small sense of satisfaction creeping over him. This wasn't just about firing one person. This was about changing the culture of the entire airline, about ensuring that no one, no matter their status, would ever be treated like Naomi had been. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. The real work was just beginning. The days following the incident on Flight 378 were a whirlwind of action for Julian. While Ms. Richards was left to process the consequences of her behavior, Julian's focus had shifted towards something far more important. The humiliation Naomi had endured wasn't an isolated incident, it was just a single symptom of a much larger issue within the company. Julian had a long-standing commitment to fairness, to justice, and he was determined to ensure that no passenger, especially not Naomi, would ever face such treatment again. His office became the center of a storm of meetings, emails, and phone calls as he took swift, decisive steps to address the systemic problems within Williams Airlines. The more he worked through the logistics of change, the clearer it became that the issue wasn't just about one flight attendant. It was about the culture of the entire airline. A culture that allowed passengers to be judged based on appearances, that tolerated biased assumptions, and that protected employees who perpetuated those injustices. One afternoon, Naomi sat beside Julian in his study at home, watching him as he read through yet another round of emails from his corporate team. Her eyes traced the sharp angles of his jaw as he scrolled, the flicker of tension in his brows revealing the depth of his thoughts. Julian was a man of action, but even he knew that lasting change took time. "Everything's moving quickly," Naomi said, breaking the silence. She sat back, cradling her coffee mug between her hands as she observed her husband. "But you know this is bigger than just a few policy changes, right?" Julian didn't look up immediately, his fingers tapping rapidly across his phone screen as he responded to another message. "I know," he said quietly, finally meeting her gaze. "But it's a start. We're changing things from the top down. A systemic overhaul." Naomi's lips curled slightly at the corners. Her thoughts drifted back to that fateful flight, the way Ms. Richards had treated her, the dismissive attitude, the coldness that was so easily directed at her simply because she didn't fit the image of what someone in first class should look like. The humiliation, while painful, had sparked a fire in Naomi. It wasn't just about getting an apology from one person or getting her revenge on the flight attendant. It was about the culture that allowed such biases to fester unchecked. "I appreciate everything you're doing," Naomi said, her voice calm but laced with conviction. "But you and I both know that this isn't just about a flight attendant. This is a bigger issue, one that isn't limited to one individual or even one company. It's systemic. There are so many layers to it." Julian nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. I've thought about that. I've been part of the problem for years without even realizing it. The system lets people like Ms. Richards get away with behavior that should never be tolerated. But it goes deeper than that. People who look like you, like me, they're treated differently, judged based on their appearance or their background. And that's not something we can ignore anymore. Naomi reached over, her fingers resting gently on his. I've been dealing with it for years, Julian. And it's not just in the airline industry. It's everywhere. People who look different are assumed to be out of place. We see it on flights, in boardrooms, in restaurants, it's all the same. Julian leaned back in his chair, sighing heavily. I've spent too much time focusing on the bottom line, on making sure we're profitable. I didn't realize how much of the system was broken until now. But Naomi, we can change that. Naomi smiled faintly, but there was a quiet sadness in her eyes. I'm not just talking about changing policies. Policies are important, but they only go so far. We need to change the way people think. We need to change their attitudes, their biases. We need to make sure that the next time something like this happens, it's not just about the person who was wronged. It's about everyone who witnessed it, who ignored it. Julian's expression softened as he gazed at her. He could see the weight in her eyes, the weight of years of silent frustration, of navigating a world that too often judged her without understanding. He had always admired her strength, but now he realized just how deep that strength ran. Naomi wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been mistreated, overlooked, or dismissed. We'll do both, Julian said, his voice firm. The policies will change, but so will the culture. This isn't just about punishing one person. It's about making sure this kind of thing never happens again, whether it's on one of my flights or anywhere else. He stood up and walked over to his desk, typing rapidly as he drafted the next email. Naomi watched him for a moment, her heart swelling with pride. Julian was a man of action, but he was also deeply aware of the responsibility that came with his position. He wasn't content to just fix one mistake. He wanted to dismantle the structures that allowed it to happen in the first place. Julian, you can't change everything overnight, Naomi said softly, watching as he clicked through a few more messages. But the fact that you're willing to try means everything. I've spent so long just trying to survive in a world that treats people like me as if we don't belong. But this is different. You're changing the rules. Julian turned back to her, his eyes filled with determination. I'm not just changing the rules. I'm rewriting them. And I'll keep doing it until people like you are never treated the way you were on that flight. Naomi felt a warm rush of gratitude wash over her, but she didn't speak for a moment. She had spent her life fighting for her place, for the recognition that her worth wasn't defined by the way people judged her on the surface. Now, with Julian by her side, she could see a future where the rules weren't just changed for her benefit, they were changed for everyone. Later that evening, Julian's team finalized the airline's new set of policies. The first major change was the mandatory bias training for all flight attendants and the introduction of a new customer complaint system that didn't require passengers to have powerful connections to be heard. Julian also pushed for increased transparency in how complaints were handled, ensuring that every passenger, no matter their social standing, would be treated with the same respect. But beyond the policies, Julian knew that the true work was still ahead. Changing the way people thought, forcing them to confront their biases, would take time. It would take constant effort, constant vigilance. But it was a fight he was ready for. As he and Naomi sat together that evening, sipping their wine in the quiet comfort of their home, they both knew that what had begun on that flight was something much bigger than a single confrontation. It was the start of a movement, one that would carry on long after Ms. Richards was gone. Naomi rested her head against Julian's shoulder, her thoughts drifting back to the airplane. I think about how many people out there will never get the chance to speak up, to make a change. But now, maybe they'll feel empowered to do so. Julian wrapped an arm around her, his voice soft but resolute. They will. And we'll make sure of it. As the night drew on, Naomi felt a deep sense of peace. The battle had been fought and won, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been dismissed or disregarded. The change was coming, and this time, it wasn't just about one person's story. It was about rewriting the rules for good. The soft hum of the car engine filled the silence as Julian navigated the busy streets of Los Angeles, taking them home after what had been a long and exhausting day. Naomi sat beside him, her fingers gently tracing the curve of her belly, a faint smile playing on her lips. The events of the past few hours still lingered in her mind, but for the first time in a long time, the weight of the world seemed a little lighter. Naomi had walked off the plane with Julian at her side, feeling the power dynamics shift completely in her favor. The passengers who had once ignored her, avoiding eye contact and pretending not to see the injustice unfold, now watched with wide eyes as Julian, confident and commanding, escorted her through the terminal. They had all seen the flight attendant, Ms. Richards, escorted off the plane, her career dangling in the balance. As they sat in the car, Naomi reflected on the journey she had just been through. She had been humiliated in front of dozens of strangers, but by the time she left the plane, she had turned the situation around. It wasn't just about one moment of retribution. It was about taking control and ensuring that it wouldn't happen again, not just for her, but for everyone who had been dismissed or belittled before. She turned her head slightly to look at Julian, his face illuminated by the streetlights as they passed. He was quiet, his eyes focused on the road ahead, but she could see the tension still lingering in his shoulders. Julian was always calm and collected, but even he was impacted by the injustice that had unfolded. His protective instinct for her was undeniable, and he had acted swiftly to make sure Ms. Richards faced the consequences of her actions. But Naomi knew that Julian's actions were just the beginning of something much bigger. "Thank you," Naomi said quietly, her voice carrying more weight than she had expected. Julian glanced at her briefly, his eyes softening for a moment before returning to the road. "For what?" he asked, his tone casual, though Naomi could sense the underlying concern. "For everything today," she replied, her fingers gently rubbing her stomach. "For standing up for me, for making sure that what happened on that plane doesn't happen again." Julian's lips curled into a small smile, but there was a hint of something darker in his eyes, something that told Naomi he wasn't finished with this fight. "I don't do it for thanks," he said softly. "I do it because it's right. No one gets to treat you, or anyone else, like that. Not on my watch." Naomi leaned back into her seat, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. For the first time in a long time, she felt like the weight of the world wasn't entirely on her shoulders. She had taken control of the situation, but more importantly, she had made sure that the system that allowed such behavior to persist would be challenged. No longer would people like Ms. Richards get away with judging others based on appearances, assumptions, or biases. As the car weaved through the streets, Naomi reflected on how much this moment had meant to her. The flight attendant's treatment had been just one example of the ways in which people like her, people of color, women, and those from marginalized backgrounds, were too often dismissed, disregarded, or treated as if they didn't belong in spaces that were deemed for others. She had been on the receiving end of it countless times before, but this time was different. This time, she had a voice. She had the support of her husband, yes, but more than that, she had the power of knowing that her actions would make a difference. Naomi's thoughts drifted to the passengers who had watched the confrontation on the plane. At first, none of them had stepped in. They had stayed silent, pretending they hadn't heard or seen the injustice unfolding before them. But once Ms. Richards had been called to the cockpit, and Naomi's true identity was revealed, things changed. Suddenly, the passengers were aware of who she was, and they saw the flight attendant for what she had done. Naomi didn't expect an apology from any of them, but she knew that something had shifted. Maybe, just maybe, the next time someone faced the same kind of treatment, someone would speak up. Maybe the passengers would no longer stay silent, as they had before. Naomi's thoughts swirled as she considered the ripple effect of what had happened. Her actions today weren't just about her personal justice, they had the potential to create a ripple effect, one that might encourage others to stand up for themselves and for those around them. She had shown that it was possible to stand firm, even in the face of humiliation, and come out stronger on the other side. Julian, ever perceptive, must have noticed the change in her demeanor. He reached over and gently took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I know you've been through a lot today," he said, his voice low and steady. "But you handled it better than anyone could have imagined. You didn't just win today, Naomi. You made sure that this won't happen again, not just for you, but for everyone." Naomi squeezed his hand, her chest swelling with pride. "I want to believe that," she said quietly, "but I know that the change we're talking about goes beyond one flight, beyond one incident. It's about changing the way people think, changing the way they treat others." Julian nodded in agreement, his gaze never leaving the road. "It's a long road, but it starts with moments like today. It starts with people like you standing up for themselves and making sure that they're heard. And if we can change the system, then we can change the culture. And if we can change the culture, we can change everything." Naomi smiled softly, her eyes reflecting a mix of hope and determination. "I'll do my part," she said. "I'll keep speaking up, and I'll make sure that when my daughter grows up, she knows she doesn't have to accept anything less than respect." As they neared their home, the familiar sight of their driveway brought a sense of relief. The car pulled into the garage, and the door slowly came down, sealing them away from the outside world. For the first time that day, Naomi felt a true sense of peace. It wasn't just about her victory, it was about the knowledge that, by speaking up, she had taken the first step toward a world where injustice wouldn't go unchallenged. As they entered their home, Naomi paused for a moment, her hand resting on the doorframe. She closed her eyes, letting the silence settle in, before turning to Julian. "We're making a difference," she said, her voice filled with quiet certainty. Julian pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. "Together," he said softly, "we'll make sure of it." And for the first time in a long while, Naomi felt at peace, knowing that her actions had already begun to change the world around her. The fight wasn't over, but it was no longer a battle she had to fight alone. As Naomi settled into the comfort of her home, the tension of the day began to melt away. The events on the plane felt like they belonged to a different world now, distant and far removed from the peaceful haven she had found in her own space. She kicked off her shoes, letting the cool, plush carpet cushion her feet, and sank into the soft embrace of the couch. The warmth of their home, the familiar scent of lavender and vanilla, wrapped around her like a protective blanket. Julian had already made himself comfortable beside her, his suit jacket discarded, his sleeves rolled up as he worked through a stack of emails. The hum of the city outside felt distant, and for a brief moment, the chaos of the world outside seemed to fade entirely. Naomi took a deep breath, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the curve of her belly as she let the calm wash over her. It had been a long day, one filled with frustration, anger, and eventual relief, but now, in the quiet of her home, she felt at peace. Looking over at Julian, Naomi couldn't help but smile. He had always been her rock, her source of strength, and today had been no different. He had acted swiftly and decisively, making sure that Ms. Richards, the flight attendant who had treated Naomi so poorly, would face the consequences of her actions. It wasn't just about the personal retribution. Julian had made it clear that he was committed to a larger change, one that would ensure no one else would ever have to endure what Naomi had. As she sat there, surrounded by the quiet comforts of their home, Naomi realized just how much this moment meant to her. It wasn't just about the victory she'd won for herself, it was about the change she had helped bring about, a change that would ripple out and affect others. Ms. Richards would have to answer for her actions, yes, but more importantly, the policies within the airline would be scrutinized and, ultimately, overhauled. It wasn't just one wronged passenger, it was a systemic issue that had allowed people like Ms. Richards to feel untouchable, to treat others with such blatant disrespect without fear of consequence. She turned her attention back to Julian, who had set his phone down and was now looking at her, his expression unreadable but soft. "You've been so quiet," she said, her voice gentle. "What's on your mind?" Julian hesitated for a moment before answering. "I'm just thinking about the bigger picture," he said, his tone thoughtful. "This goes beyond one flight, beyond one incident. We can't just look at this as a one-time mistake. It's about the way people are treated, the way they're made to feel like they don't belong, like they're not entitled to the same respect as everyone else." Naomi nodded, her fingers now resting against her stomach. "I know. I thought the same thing. I know this won't be the last time something like this happens, but at least now people will know that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated." Julian's eyes softened, and he leaned back against the couch, his arm casually draped over the back. "You're right. We can't change everything overnight, but we can start making the changes that matter. Ms. Richards may have been the catalyst for this, but it's the policies, the culture, the attitudes that need to change. I'm not just going to let this go. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again, not to you, not to anyone." Naomi's heart swelled with pride as she watched him, knowing that his commitment to justice extended far beyond the immediate moment. Julian didn't just fight for the small victories, he fought for systemic change, for a world where people would no longer be treated based on assumptions and biases. She knew he was already thinking ahead, planning the next steps to ensure that the airline, and the industry as a whole, would be held accountable. "I don't want to be the only one who gets to have a voice," Naomi said quietly, her gaze fixed on Julian. "I don't want to be the only one who gets justice. There are so many others out there who won't have the same opportunity. What happens to them?" Julian's gaze softened, and he reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "We fix it for everyone," he said, his voice firm. "This isn't just about you or me. It's about everyone who's ever been dismissed, belittled, or ignored. It's about making sure no one ever has to face that kind of treatment again. And I won't stop until we change the system. It's time for real accountability, Naomi." Naomi smiled at him, the weight of the world slowly lifting from her shoulders. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt like things were finally starting to shift. The small actions they had taken today, the texts, the calls, the confrontation, had set in motion a wave of change that couldn't be undone. The airline would review its policies. New training would be implemented. The incident would be investigated, not just from the top down but also from the ground up, to make sure that every passenger was treated with dignity and respect. Julian wasn't just looking for retribution. He was looking for long-term, meaningful change. And Naomi, though she had suffered the indignity of being publicly humiliated, had played her part in making sure that this wouldn't just be a footnote in her own life. It would be a turning point, a moment in history where people realized that they couldn't get away with treating others as less than human simply because of their appearance or status. Naomi leaned back into the couch, closing her eyes as she exhaled deeply. "I'm proud of us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Julian squeezed her hand and smiled, the warmth of his touch comforting her. "Me too," he replied softly. "And we'll keep fighting for what's right. For you, for our daughter, and for anyone else who needs someone to stand up for them." The room was quiet for a few moments, the only sound the distant hum of the city outside. Naomi felt a deep sense of satisfaction settle in her chest. The battle was far from over, but she knew they had already won the most important part of it. Justice had been served. Ms. Richards would face the consequences of her actions, yes, but more importantly, the world had shifted. Naomi had reminded herself and everyone else that no one had the right to diminish someone else's worth. She had stood up for herself, and now, thanks to Julian's unwavering commitment, the ripple effect of that moment would be felt long after the day had passed. As Naomi finally allowed herself to relax, she knew that no matter what came next, she had done more than just fight for herself. She had fought for a better future, a future where respect, fairness, and accountability were no longer optional, but expected. And that, Naomi knew, was the first step toward real change. The story of Evelyn, 7 months pregnant, asking for a simple request, a pillow, on a flight highlights a powerful lesson about human dignity and the impact of small actions on larger systems. Sometimes, the discomfort we face in life isn't just physical, it's the silent mistreatment that erodes our sense of worth. Evelyn's experience with the rude flight attendant, Ms. Richards, reflects a deeper issue: the systemic biases that perpetuate inequality in everyday interactions. What Evelyn faced wasn't just a dismissive comment, it was a glimpse into a culture that assumes some people deserve respect more than others based on their status. This story teaches us that no one should have to endure disrespect or humiliation, and that standing up for oneself, even in the face of discomfort or fear, is vital for change. Evelyn's husband, Marcus, didn't just address the issue at hand, he tackled a broader issue of systemic unfairness within the airline industry, setting the stage for policy changes that will impact not only Evelyn but others who might never have the chance to stand up for themselves. This is a reminder that personal actions, when tied to a larger cause, can lead to lasting societal shifts. As we navigate our lives, it's essential to remember that every interaction matters. Whether it's in a workplace, on a flight, or in our communities, the way we treat others shapes the world around us. Injustice isn't just about individual wrongs, it's about the systems that allow these wrongs to go unchecked. Like Evelyn and Marcus, we all have the power to challenge and change these systems. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you watching from? And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Ring the bell so you never miss a story that can inspire change.